Hello, welcome to the Best Book Ever podcast. I'm Rabbi David Kasher, your host, and today I am going to learn some Torah with Madison Margolin. And Madison's an old friend, and we've been learning together a long time. So welcome to the podcast. And I'd love to just have you tell us what you're up to in the world. What are you doing these days?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It's really fun to be learning with you again, especially after all of these years of knowing you and I guess knowing you as my rabbi at Berkeley and so forth. So I think it's very cute and full circle. So what am I up to these days? Officially, I'm an author, journalist, writer. I wrote a book called Exile and Ecstasy, growing up with Ram Dass and coming of age in the Jewish Psychedelic Underground. And so the book really details like my life the past 10 plus years, which is uh, being in New York for journalism school, having come from sort of the California hippie movement. My dad was old friends with Ram Dass, author of Be Here Now, and sort of that whole like hippie Hindu movement of Jews who went to India and found spirituality there because they were sort of disillusioned with post-Holocaust Judaism. And as a journalism student, I fell in with the Hasidim, essentially in Brooklyn and Muncie and other parts of New York, and found that they were doing psychedelics in all of these underground scenes. And it got me wondering, like, can you have a Jewish experience with psychedelics? Or what does a psychedelic experience look like and feel like through a Jewish framework? And so a lot of my journalism, writing, reporting has been centered around that question. Especially coming again from sort of like the more hippie background, like Ram Dass had a psychedelic background, studying LSD and psilocybin at Harvard when he was a professor there. And so nowadays I'm doing more writing, reporting, editing, all of that, as well as kind of working with communities in New York, looking at like what psychedelic best practice and harm reduction looks like for Hasidic specific demographics. And so I split my time between New York and Tzfat, where I currently am, writing and doing field work.
Wow, amazing. Okay, so I guess where I wanna you're the perfect person to talk to, or at least we've made you the perfect person to talk to because what we're going to be looking at today is psychedelic imagery in the Torah. And even to say that, the second question would be, well, what do you mean psychedelic imagery in the Torah? Is that like are they're not taking psychedelics in the Torah? So I guess I mean your upbringing and your professional life makes you well qualified to think about the relationship between the psychedelic experience and the religious experience. I mean, you mentioned right away the sort of Hindu and psychedelic kind of like um, pieces of your upbringing and surroundings. So I want to think about that in the Jewish framework, but I think first we need to define what that adjective. Like I know what psychedelics as drugs are, but like maybe you could give us some definition, or we could start to formulate some definition of what is a psychedelic experience? How do you think of that word insofar as it has come to be used outside of just a drug context?
Definitely, there's a certain class of substances that can occasion a psychedelic experience within a person. But I really think of it a lot more broadly. I think you can have a psychedelic experience with or without substance. And again, there's no shortage of like narratives from Torah and so forth that shed light on that. And so officially psychedelic, like etymologically speaking, means mind manifesting. Um, Recently, I read something on the internet by Ben Malcolm, who goes by the spirit pharmacist, that psychedelic is a little bit like of a false concept because it really should be psychosomatodellic, meaning to say that it not only like puts into stark relief what's happening beneath the surface of your subconscious, but also like what's happening in the body, like what is like the full embodied experience of expanded consciousness, right? Um, and if you even think about like the about Kabbalah, for instance, right? And the Sphirot and the way that like consciousness is concentrated throughout, like in different realms and different spheres in the in the tree of life, like you see, like your right side has like this consciousness associated with chesed and left is gevura, right? Like how consciousness really is spread throughout the body. Um, and so psychedelics, again, like really put you into like that embodied experience in a different way. And the other thing I'll say about a quote psychedelic experience, to quote Albert Hofmann, who's the chemist who first synthesized LSD, is that he called it medicine for the soul. And I really think that what a psychedelic experience does, again, whether you have substance or not, is it dampens the ego, right? It like dampens the part of the brain that's most associated with your like fixed patterns, sense of self, individuality. And when that like ego state is, the volume is lower on that, then like what is your primary identity, right? And I really feel like that is the soul, like the part of ourselves that has the capacity for divine connection and is sort of like divinely inspired. And so any psychedelic experience, I think, can really put us in touch with like our core nature, both on like the level of soul and also the level of connecting with nature, with, you know, with the natural world at large, the cosmos, the plants, the earth, and then of course with God, right? And I would say like any like um, any experience of God really, I think, is the most quintessential psychedelic experience.
I love that that formulation, but I want you to say a couple more sentences about it because that's so fascinating. Like what it might, and that's really where we're headed, to think about how the encounters with God described in our, sacred scriptures in Tanakh appear sometimes to be what we would call now psychedelic visually. But you're not just talking visually, you're really talking about, as you said, an expansion of consciousness. So, like every encounter with God is a psychedelic experience. Like, say a little bit more what you mean by that.
So a few things. First of all, like scientifically speaking, if we want to like back this up, so to speak, Rick Strassman, who's a FDA like psychedelic, he was the first person to get FDA approval to do psychedelic research in America in the early 90s. Um, Basically did a lot of research looking at the prophetic state of mind and being in comparison to the DMT state, right? And so does prophecy in some way, like does the prophetic state, which is like I guess a direct communication with God in some way, like uh, show parallel features with the DMT state. So there's that, okay? That being said, I also think that like when you put it into terms of like mochin de katnit and mochin de godless, right? Like constricted mind and expanded mind, when we're in the mode of expanded mind, we're able to sort of like have share perspective with God, right? And you think about when we go to tzaddikim or saints, like holy people or whatever, a lot of Rabbi Nachman talks about this, like a tzaddik doesn't really have a metaphysical shadow, meaning to say that like their ego is so like turned, they're in like this psychedelic state, like beyond the ego, where like their perspective and their will aligns with that of the divine. And so on a microdose type of level of that, we have opportunities to connect with God in a more direct way through, for instance, like Hitbodedut, or just plain davening, right? Where for just like 1 minute, 1 second, for 1 hour, whatever it is, we're able to like try to tap the part of ourselves that has the capacity to communicate with God. And as Rick Strassman has told me, like humans, like our brains are designed so that we can have divine communication. Now, not everyone is chosen for it officially. Like you can talk to God, whether God talks back is like a whole different story.
Right, the psychedelic experience is often what happens when God is talking back, right? Like that's a good way to
Right.
put it. I mean, it's so interesting the way you're describing it because you are talking about a shift in consciousness, but I think that you are suggesting that there's also something about the psychedelic journey that is a move towards, you know, a more some kind of truth. Like there's some idea that you might be accessing something that is that is authentic, talking about connections to nature, connections to self, or maybe a loss of self, which is an important kind of truth in its own way. And that's a very different framework than we associate psychedelics with drugs, and we associate drugs with some kind of distortion or falseness. But then again, we know that the category of drugs or intoxicants, I don't know what the right word that we call psychedelics, is often used, and has been since the Ram Dass days, not just for fun, but for exploration. So that there's something, trippy about all of this, but it is also, even as we get into this wild imagery, there's a way in which part of what we're asking is whether this sort of wild imagery is actually tapping us into something true and authentic and not something strange and distorted, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with the ego and with trauma. And in religious terms, you can call it the klipot in a way. Like the things that like stick to us, like on top of the core MS, on top of the core truth. And the ego is like your like who you think you are, right? Like your personalized perspective on the world that is based, first of all, ego is not the enemy. Like you need a healthy degree of ego just to like function, right? Like you need a sense of self in order to care for your own personal needs and so forth. But it's a very tricky thing where the ego gets injured the same way the body gets injured, right? Like you come into the world as like a perfect being, so to speak. I mean, not everyone, whatever, but like ideally, right? And over the course of time, like the vessel, the body like gets cuts and gets injured and gets like pimples and all these things that it's like, okay, that's not like the truth of what you are. It's like something that happened to you, right? That's like a type of trauma that's like becomes a little bit of a stain on your consciousness or on your ego or on your body or on your mind. And when we're talking about psychedelics, a lot of the time we're talking about like quote unquote healing and so forth. So it's like getting to like the part of yourself that is like underneath the like the traumas of what happened to us. And I really do believe like and I again probably there's text to back this up where like our core state, like our neshama, like the soul, like the core state is goodness, it's bliss, it just is. Like it's not good or bad, it just is. Like the soul is beyond the body. Like the soul is like that fractalized piece of God that like comes into like comes to animate like human form. Especially when I talk to people or work with people doing psychedelics, like I really try to remind them to identify as a soul rather than identifying with like their normal sense of like self that's more of like an ego driven thing.
I want to dive into the material, but actually, like as we're talking, I feel like there's one more more personal question that I want to ask before we get into it. Like here you are, someone who is writing about this stuff, who has like an expertise in this stuff, and clearly a certain kind of passion, like even maybe a mission in explicating all of this. And I'm sort of thinking as you're talking, like, okay, you grew up in a household, who with big, sort of this culture around you, and Judaism and Hinduism and sort of the psychedelic experience. And I guess I would, one of the paths I would expect from a girl who grew up in that environment is just totally rebelling and becoming completely like straight edge, kind of like I'm not interested in that stuff. And I'm kind of curious to hear how you actually took it on, and you're like you have a certain kind of legacy that you're carrying forth. And I just love to hear how it became like you kind of continued the family tradition, so to speak, as opposed to
Yeah, I
rebelling
mean,
from it.
the rebellion I think is like the Jewish thing, right? Like, and I think also like my parents rebelled. Like they were very like not like my parents and Ram Dass and that whole community were turned off by post-Holocaust dry like Judaism. And so they went to psychedelics, they went to India, they went to, the hippie scene looking for spirituality. And, like it's kind of like I have this joke because like especially Ram Dass, right? Like for his whole life, he was like, "I'm a Hindu" or "I'm a Hindu" or whatever, and only at the end of his life did he get close to the Reb Zalman and did acid with him and whatever. And my rebellion, I talk about like I one of the first chapters in my book is like the rebellion of not being here now, right? Like part of rebellion is dissociation, right? It's like dissociating from what you are, from where you come, or where you come from. So I'm not, I've dissociated a lot in my life, and I go over this in the book. as well. Like in high school, I had an eating disorder, and I like kind of was just like had a time, especially where I like really was anti like the hippie thing, like not anti hippie, but like, and I was like, as a kid, I was like, I hated the Hindus, I hated kirtan, I hated everything that my parents had to expose me to, and like when you're rebelling, you're still kind of controlled by the thing, right? Because it's like you're still in relation to it. You're just rebelling from it rather than accepting it. And so I think there's a reconciliation that happens. And so I always say like Ram Dass is like my troll, you know, like even in like he left his body, but like he's always trolling me. I'm always like having to be reminded to like be present, to be here now. That term like really whatever, I have feelings around it. But one thing is like a lot of the Jews in this quote psychedelic renaissance are obsessed with Ram Dass. And it's like, who would have thought that like in modern times, like his biggest fans would be like really like Jewy Jews, right? And like for him, that must be so embarrassing. Like he was just trying to get away from that. And so I'm like I'm gonna have him in mind every time I like do a mitzvah and like make tshuva for Ram Dass. Like after he's
Trolling him
like
back
tro
now.
I'm trolling him back. I'm trolling him back. So that's where I'm holding with it.
That's great. That's
Yeah.
great. I mean, that's just like a great concept. The concept of like the spiritual troll, you know, it's just like, come on, be here now, be here now. Remember. Okay, so
Hmm.
let's get into the material. And because of all of that, I'm especially excited to just hear. We're just going to study Torah together, but just to hear how your brain processes these texts, which I think are, I've picked three texts, and we're mainly going to focus on one, but three texts throughout the whole Tanakh that I think are the most, well, trippy, the most psychedelic. We can talk about whether that word will apply here or not, but certainly some of the most the most far out and difficult to make sense of imagery, wild, vivid imagery that that is not just wild, you know, in and of itself, but is, as you suggested earlier, uh, a way of describing the divine encounter. Again and again, all of these scenes are going to be scenes where people are encountering and sometimes even, like, so to speak, seeing God. And that's exactly where we get some of these the most psychedelic images in the Torah. So let's just start in the Torah. We're really heading towards Yechezkel, Ezekiel. That's where the classic image, the most and the most psychedelic image in our tradition. But also that passage from Ezekiel is thought of as kind of the beginning, maybe, of the Jewish mystical tradition. Um, and you keep referencing that the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, and it seems no coincidence that a discussion of psychedelic imagery takes you not just to consciousness and religion, but to the mystical side of that. And I want to think about that a little bit with you. But let's start with a text from the Torah itself, and it's in the book of Exodus, just after the revelation at Sinai, and Moshe and Aaron and Nadav and Avihu, and then also the 70 elders are heading up the mountain. They don't go all the way up the mountain because that's Moshe eventually goes up by himself, but they start to go up the mountain, and then all of a sudden the Torah says this, well, this trippy thing, which is that they saw the God of Israel. Vayiru et Elokei Israel. So that's already for us who are kind of raised in, God is beyond body and form. This is like, what does this even mean, that you might see God at all? And then the language that immediately follows, the thing that they seem to see is v'tachat raglav k'maseh livnata sapir uke'etzem hashamayim letohar. And under God's legs or feet was something like bricks of sapphire, and it was as pure as the sky. Okay, now that in itself, that's like the image, something like bricks of sapphire, and it was as pure as the sky. And we're going to return to this imagery again and again. That is one of the things that we're going to see, is certain images keep popping up, but like it's like you're looking up at God and you see God's legs. First of all, that's bizarre. Like, what is God's legs? Does God have legs? But also this particular image of of seeing sapphire or bricks of sapphire. And I want to just immediately insert here, because we are referencing the Jewish mystical tradition, that in Kabbalah, this language of sapphire is very close to, sapir is very close to the central concept in Jewish mysticism, which is the sfirot, the 10 divine emanations. And so the Kabbalists see this as an allusion to those sfirot. Like we look up at God and we see that the bricks of sapphire, that is, we see the 10 divine emanations and God somehow hovering above them all. So that is one way to make sense of this image, but it doesn't even really make, I mean, what does that even mean? Like, it doesn't really make sense of this image. So I want to know what you think about it in general, but I'm especially interested in whether this as we head in, whether you would agree that this is a psychedelic experience, like what they're describing as a psychedelic encounter. Would you use that language?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely psychedelic. I mean, it's like it's throwing me off because like we don't describe like it's so rare. I mean, our concept of God is that he's like beyond concept, right? That like there's no visual, like that's what distinguishes Jew. Like we're not Hindus, we don't like paint pictures of God, and so to even like have God described through like form is very distinct from like the way that I conceptual from the way that I understand God personally.
That emphasis on the visual, and as you're saying, the visual, which is usually thought of as something that we can't have with God, maybe even shouldn't have with God. And so I'm interested in that Jewishly, but I'm also interested in it from a psychedelics perspective, because so much of what we think about in the psychedelic realm is the visual experience. Like usually when we use that word in sort of common English, we start imagining, that's why I picked these scenes, right? We start imagining these visuals, and psychedelics are not always visual. So I'm just like I'm curious about the emphasis on the visual spectacle of the psychedelic experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, the spherot are like attached to like different like color schemes, right? Like there isn't like, so if you're tripping hard enough, like you can stare at the sky and like see patterns and colors, like, and that's, you could say that's not real, or you could call it like a channel of divine consciousness that we're not usually tuned into. Um, but I would imagine like what I'm reading from this is like they're having a psychedelic experience. How that has been occasioned is another story, but okay. And maybe they are seeing like some sort of like color, like colors in certain area, like if they talk about hand and feet, which is also a little bit weird, but maybe it's like where they're like where these like forms or colors are positioned. Um, That would be like part of my guess, especially because you did mention like the sapphire relation etymological relationship with Sphirot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting as you're talking about, oh, maybe the hands and feet represent placement or something else. And I think that's also part of what we're investigating in the psychedelic experience, but just as a matter of interpretation of religious texts, we often assume that the visual image we're presented is a symbol for something else or a metaphor for something else. So you are having a very visual experience, but it's not meant to indicate that God has limbs so much as it's meant to indicate that you are seeing something which will help you understand something that the visual image is actually not the full extent of. So there's this like kind of delicate balance there where you're being invited to use your visual senses and colors and things like that, but also somehow to maintain an awareness that this is pointing towards something else, or this symbolizes something else.
Yeah, I think also people who are really spiritually tuned in do see colors, do see like elements of divine consciousness that's not um available to everybody. And it's like that's like those are the people who can like read the color of your aura or whatever. And like it sounds a little bit, I don't know, pagan's not the word, but like, I once I was with a woman, like a very spiritually like sensitive person, and she was on MDMA, and she was like really seeing, she's like, your soul is this color. Like she was like telling, she's like, one of us was yellow and the other was purple. I forget who, but like, okay, like what is that? Is that God? I mean, maybe it's an expression of God. Like that's another thing is like when we talk about like what is God, if God is everything, then like when we're talking about form, like it's not like God is the tree, but there God is within the tree. Like it's not like the tree represents God, but God is also within the things that are represented.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. That is very interesting, and trees are one of those images that appear often in some of these mist with these sort of classically mystical Jewish texts.
Is there a right answer to the way to interpret this?
Well, I guess I mentioned the Kabbalistic interpretation because that suggests that there is a right answer, that this is a code which is difficult to understand. It strikes us as something like you can't, what is this? We have no idea. Oh, maybe they understood it back then, but we have no idea what they're talking about. But when you make that link to a whole theological, cosmological framework and you make that link linguistically, then part of what you're suggesting is that yeah, I know this looks far out, but this is actually there's a right answer here. This is pointing to some distinct mystical truth, and that's kind of a bold claim. Like that's a big thing to say, oh, if you really know how to read this text, you'll understand what Moses must have understood back then, which is that God hovers over 10 forces and they are the spherode and all this is very specific stuff. So in that sense, yeah, I guess there would be a right answer, you know? Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay, so from here, we're gonna like there are many places in the Torah we could go and just think about wild imagery. I mean, as you were talking about people who read auras, I was thinking, oh, like I'm sure Moshe could read auras, right? Like if he had the power to communicate with God, like maybe he was tuned into some of this stuff, and so maybe it's no wonder that he saw sapphire or that he saw a burning bush. You know what I mean? And it makes me wonder like if another person was standing there, would they have seen the burning bush, or was it just something that Moshe could tune into visually? Or so that all of that is interesting. But I want to, with that stage set, I want to kind of leap us forward past the Torah into the books of the prophets and take us to, I alluded to this already, but to this
Hmm.
most classic mystical vision, and I think the most psychedelic passage in our Tanakh, which is this first chapter from the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is one of our greatest prophets, one of the big ones. With there are minor prophets, and he was a major prophet. And but he was distinct. He prophesied from Bavel, from Babylon. So that already is interesting. He's in the exile and he's seeing visions in the exile. That's sort of how he announces his prophecy is like there I was standing by the rivers in the rivers of Babylon, literally, and I saw visions of God. And that's a huge thing to say. I saw visions va'ere marot Elokim. I saw visions of God. And that's what we're talking about here. So it's visual. And then when he gets into it, it is so visual. It is so vivid. And I'm not going to read all of it because it's so dense, but I want to just read some of it just so we have a sense of how much imagery is going on. And I'll just say that at the center of it all, there are these four creatures. Okay, that's one of the things that we're going to encounter here, but there's lots going on. So he says, I looked, and a stormy wind came sweeping out of the north, a huge cloud and flashing fire surrounded by a radiance. And in the center of it, in the center of the fire, was an electric glow, like hashmal. We now use that word for electricity. Obviously, that's not exactly the right translation, but that's where we get this idea of some kind of buzzing light, the hashmal. And so there's some glow. And then there in the center of it, he says, were also the figures of four creatures. They had the figures of human beings, these figures, but each of them had four faces and four wings. and the legs of each were fused into a single leg. This is part of where we get the idea that angels have like they don't have two legs, but just have like a single leg, just hop. If you've ever heard that idea, angels hopping up and down. Um, I'm not going to go too much further because it's just there's so much here, but the feet of each were like a calf's hoof, and they had human hands below the wings, and then I just want to also talk about their movement here because that's a big part of it also, which is that there seem to be wheels, and the wheels move around and they can move in any of the four directions. And I mean, I don't know how much further to go here. I mean, like I could keep reading, but I want to just highlight one last thing, which is that this, given what we just said about the Moshe's vision on the mountain, Ezekiel also says that above the heads of these figures was the image of a throne. A throne. Now, that's an image that we use in our prayers, God sitting on God's throne. But this is sort of where it comes from. He sees the throne, and on the throne, he says, there was an mare Evan Sapir. There was this image of sapphire. Okay, and there's that sapphire again. Like there's some connection here that just as a matter of literature, you see, Yechezkel's clearly referencing something that happens earlier in Moshe's vision in the Torah. So maybe I'll just stop there. I mean, I could just keep going, and it's like it gets the more details you add, the like harder it is to process. But we've got a lot already. We've got these four figures and animal imagery, and but we've got this light, and we've got color, and we've even got this connection to sapphire. So I mean, let's try to make sense of any of it. But maybe a good place to start is in thinking about the recurring imagery. The idea that Ezekiel seems to see something, even when he says a throne, it's like, oh, they looked up and saw God's legs, God, I don't know, maybe sitting or something. Like this idea that there's a throne, and above the throne is some exalted God figure, but below the throne there are lesser figures, or there's that sapphire again. There are the reference to the 10 divine emanations. So I'm curious what you think about it, all of that. But I guess I'm wondering specifically about the idea of coming back to certain images, of certain images recurring in psychedelic visions, of like tapping into a certain kind of light or a certain kind of symbol again and again.
I think it's validating. I mean, I just want to point out one more thing that at the end of the chat of the passage where it says that was the appearance of the image of the presence of God. Um, just calling it out straight up as like the image of the presence, I think is like kind of a very, again, like too much on the nose type of way of saying it. But I think the fact that there is recurrent imagery or recurrent themes like sapphire corroborates it. So it's like the more it recurs, the more it's valid in a way, because like there's a consistency to it that like gives it like something to stand on. Like I don't know why this is coming to me, but like Aldous Huxley wrote in Heaven and Hell, which is like the addendum essay to Doors of Perception, that like if you look at all of the houses of worship all over the world, it's like sort of like glittering geometric patterns. Like no matter where you are, like in South America or Middle East or India or whatever, cathedrals, and like it shows that like there's something to the mystical experience, like this agnostic perennialist thing with mysticism that has shared imagery. So it's like there's a mysticism that's like beyond language, beyond culture, whatever. So when we're going here and talking about like this sapphire thing and like the sphere, what I'm understanding is like it sort of like suggests that like there is like a, I don't want to use the word hierarchy, but like a verticality to like the experience of God, and it comes in like different, well, the word here I'm looking is radiances, and that's really what the zero mean. It's like divine emanations. So like how is God revealing himself in like these ordered microdoses of divine light?
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
just light. We're just seeing, and light cannot be argued with. That light, I have no problem talking about the image of God in terms of literally seeing light. I can get down with that more than I can get down with like any like man in the sky like Zeus figure.
Right. Yeah, that's so, there's this is so um this is so helpful what you're suggesting here, which is, reminding us of recurring images in all kinds of intense human experiences, end of life experiences. I mean, you just use the phrase seeing light, and there's often this like the light at the end of the tunnel. Like, why do when people have these near death experiences, why do they see the same things? Or even like, whatever, people abducted by aliens, like describe aliens in the same way. Whatever it is, like this may refer to some truth in the vision, or it may refer to some truth in the human brain. Like the human brain goes to these forms of perception. Yeah, so that in itself is just I think a very helpful and fascinating parallel, that religion returns again and again to certain images, but the human mind returns again and again to certain images in moments of, I don't know, extreme ends of our consciousness, extreme ends of our human experience. So that's fascinating. And then what you're saying about light also, I think, is very powerful. I mean, light is the first thing created in the universe, according to our tradition. And that's significant. And then the fact that these prophetic visions keep returning to light. And you're right, Ezekiel really lays such emphasis on all the lights. There's so many lights glowing, and it's radiant. There's like a rainbow, there's electricity, it's just like it's as if he's grasping for, we were talking about colors earlier, but it's colors of light, frequencies of light. And that is a pretty, I mean, I don't want to make science of all this because that's sort of not the point, but there is something really compelling about light as the way we perceive anything, and God, the one who's beyond all perception, but the one who creates light as the first thing, and it sort of gives us a world that we can perceive. So then when Ezekiel turns around and says, I'm seeing the upper end of what's possible, or maybe the lower end of God, like somewhere in that meeting place, part of what I'm seeing is just radiance and light. That's like an image which I think you're suggesting in a way makes sense. You can get aboard with that, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, I think also like the consistency shows a degree of objectivity, right? Where it's like not like the sapphire thing isn't just Moshe and Aaron and whoever. It's not just Yecheskel. It's like the objectivity shows that it's a truth beyond the individual, right? And that like people who have the capacity to tune into those like channels, those frequencies, are have access to seeing like that same thing, right? Like the same way like we all of us have like the same like visual color palette that our eyes have the ability to process, and like only when you are in an expanded state are you able to actually see more colors, right? It doesn't mean that they're not real. In fact, they might be very real, just on a different channel that we're not all tuned into. um and the prophets are, that's what makes them prophets.
I think I hear you suggesting between the lines, and the prophets are, and we should be, like, or we should try to be. I mean, like, I'll get back to the text in a second, but I'm curious whether along the way here you're sort of, as a journalist, as a thinker, you're advocating the psychedelic experience, and maybe our religious texts are too. They're saying, this is usually not possible, but it's good, and if you can get there, you should, and that you should at least contemplate it. I mean, does that sound right to you? Like, go for the psychedelic experience. It's a peak human experience.
Only if you have the kalium to hold it. Because I have a chapter in my book called Too Much Light. Like I've seen people like literally like get cracked out like a light bulb. Like it busts you open to the point where if you don't have a strong enough ability to be grounded in yourself while you're having these experiences of light, like it can be very psychologically and dangerous. So I do think like light is like everyone wants light, like enlightenment, right? He saw the light, like that's like across the board, across cultures, like light is it, right? Like the sun, whatever, the moon, it's all about light. But I think what Judaism I mean, I'm sure other cultures too, but I'll just in Jewish terminology, like God is the or and God is the kalim. Like we have Keter, like we have like sort of like the origin of all of the divine radiance emanations, like from the top of like just the ultimate like light beyond vessel. And then we also have Malchus, like which is the ultimate vessel, right? Like the grounding that really is able from the ground up is able to like to hold all of that light in a way that's like in the here and now and not necessarily having to be like this like godly thing that's like beyond us, but it's actually the God that's like right here.
You know, this idea that it can be too dangerous. The language you're using is if you have the kalim, the vessels to hold it, and that language, I'll just say for those who might not be familiar, that language comes from the cosmology of the Arizal, who says that God, gave light into the world, and the vessels that were there to hold it just couldn't, and they broke, and that's where we get this idea of like the shattered vessels and the sparks that are sort of all over the universe, so to speak. Um, but but this notion that it might be too much for you, the light might be too much for you, you might not be able to hold it. So you've written about it in your book, and we can talk about it you know in contemporary experiences using psychedelics. But even in these religious texts, these psychedelic texts, these mystical texts, are also the texts that we are very careful about in Jewish tradition. The Mishnah in Chagiga famously says, that you shouldn't study Maseh HaMerkava, the work of the chariot, which is this. Ezekiel I gave a lot of imagery, but in the end, there's some chariot that God is riding, and there are wheels on that chariot, there are figures on that chariot, but God is above it all. But that idea, the chariot, the Merkava, is something that the Mishnah says you shouldn't teach this to too many people. You shouldn't teach it too easily. You should be careful about learning it. And a lot of us are familiar with the idea that Kabbalah is something you don't learn maybe till you're 40, or till you've learned the rest of the Torah, or till you have to have the right mind for it, or it'll crack your mind. And so that is an interesting parallel. You're talking about this with the with the drug experience, but it's true for the religious experience as well, that you might not have the kalim, the vessels to hold it. Okay, so we're going to look at one more psychedelic image from our tradition, and this one we started in the Torah and we moved to the books of the prophets, and now we're in the last section of Tanakh, of our sacred our Bible, and that is the book of Daniel, which is our most what's the word, eschatological, meaning like the end of times. That's the book that most seems to describe some future reality. Like in Christianity, it's like the book of Revelations. In our tradition, the book of Daniel is doing that work. And so Daniel has these visions of things that will happen in the future, and we get a lot of our ideas about Mashiach, for example, the Messiah from Daniel. But I'll describe this a little bit, and again, it'll be trippy stuff. But what's interesting, given our conversation so far, is that again we see some of this recurring imagery. Daniel also sees four creatures, just like Ezekiel did, and in this case, they're four beasts, as he put it. And our tradition comes to understand these as the four exiles, the four kingdoms that we have to pass through before we get to the Messianic era. But let's just take a look at some of Daniel's. Again, by the way, I just want to say again, prophesying, or whether Daniel was a prophet or not, there's some debate, but he was doing his visioning from Babylon. So this is fascinating to me, that the most psychedelic kind of prophets, so to speak, are prophesying from exile as opposed to from the land of Israel. But let's take a look here. In my vision at night, I saw the four winds of heaven stirring up in the great sea, and four mighty beasts emerged from the sea. Arba Chevan, Rav Revan, Salkan Minyama. Daniel that was Aramaic, and the book of Daniel is distinct in that it is largely in Aramaic, and that makes sense, right? Coming out of Babylon. So he sees four mighty beasts, just like Ezekiel did. The first was a lion, but had eagle's wings. Okay. The second was a bear with fangs in its mouth, and it was told, get up and eat meat. So there's like all kinds of stuff going on here. Then there's another one like a leopard, but has wings, and it had four heads. And then he says, in the night he had a vision of a fourth beast that was very powerful and had iron teeth and devoured and crushed everything around it. And so those are the four kingdoms. And, without even getting into mysticism, just the symbolism of it is often thought of, as I said, as, well, one of them is Rome, and one of them is Persia, and one of them is Babylon. But then on top of it all, Daniel says, and then I looked on, and thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat, the Atik Yomin. That's a description of God, the Ancient of Days, that we see come up again throughout the Kabbalistic tradition, but this is where it starts. And I'll just give this last description. His garment was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like lamb's wool. And his throne was tongues of flame, and its wheels were blazing fire. A river of fire streamed forth before him. Thousands upon thousands served him. Myriads upon myriads attended him. And the court sat, and the books were opened. Okay, so just like rivers of fire.
Wow.
Wild stuff, wild stuff. But we will note that there are again wheels, and there are again these four creatures, and there's a return once again to certain tropes, and above all, the trope of God sitting on God's throne and being kind of exalted above it all. And this God who we're not supposed to be able to see, who the Torah says you stood at Mount Sinai, you didn't see a vision of, but Daniel's seeing a vision of it, and Ezekiel's seeing a vision, and the vision is of a man, a great man with like flowing white hair. Now, this obviously like takes us into the whole like people get anxious about God as a man in the sky. That's like it almost becomes a trope to rebel against this image. But for the purpose of our investigation, this figure of God on the throne is really at the heart of this psychedelic vision. We think of the book of Daniel as a book of real prophecy in the sense that it tells us about the future. Like that there are secrets in there, not just about the nature of God, but like the nature of history. And I wonder if any of that fits into your thinking about the psychedelic experience as a prophetic experience, as one that has insights about our history and where we're headed and where we should be headed. Because that's surprising that our most like future looking text is also one of our most psychedelic.
It's not. I don't think so because when you think about what the psychedelic experience is, like in its most quintessential form, it's beyond time, right? It's when time is doesn't exist, right? So the past, the present, the future all exist simultaneously, and you're like behind the veil, and so you're able to see, like, you're able to see the future, for example, right? Like you're beyond time and space, and so that's why on psychedelics, and I've actually experienced this firsthand. Like I've had like in ayahuasca, like telepathic experiences with someone once, or like I've had like the concepts of like thinking of things that were like going to happen and then did happen, and like I'm not calling myself a psychic by any means, but I do think that like when you play behind the veil a little bit, like you are privy to certain truths that are not available in the mundane world of time and space. So it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's really helpful. That's really insightful. That idea that we talk about this sometimes in Jewish theology. God is beyond time, God creates time, we exist in time. And so it makes some sense that the prophetic experience, the experience of being able to see past our reality a little bit to see into the divine reality is an experience that would allow you to see beyond time, and therefore you would see the future and the past. Like it's not that you can see forward, but more, as you're describing it, that you're able to see kind of beyond time, the collapse of time, and so you can tap into the whole continuum. That might make some sense of the prophet as the one who sees the future, because the prophet is the one who can escape human time a little bit, the perspective of human time a little bit. I think that's a fascinating
I mean,
insight into
I don't even,
prophecy.
yeah, and I don't even think it's like the prophet is reading I mean, I think reading the future is like one part of prophecy, but I really think the prophet is understanding the inner workings of God and being a messenger for that. Like it's not, it's like the prophet is like, God said this, and that is just could be like a truth about the present. It doesn't have to be like this is going to happen to you or whatever to the Jewish people in X number of years. So, and I do think like, again, I've had these experiences too where like I've done a psychedelic like ayahuasca or something, and like come back with like theories of God, like personally speaking. And I'm not saying like my theories are correct. It's just more like informs like what is this concept of God that I'm interfacing with in my regular life and in my psychedelic life. And again, being able to like really have this like um I think like it's called the paragod or something, like the Gershon Winkler writes about it, like the veil, like it's lifting the veil, right? So like when you're when the psychedelic experience endogenously or otherwise occasioned um turns down the volume on like the ego, which is like the klipot in front of like this mochin to godless, then like you are able to like again like get on board with God's inner workings a little bit. Like he's showing you, he's like lifting the veil and kind of showing you um like this is the way that I work. This is what's going to happen. This is what I have to say. And I think the whole thing with prophecy is that we're not all cut out to be prophets. Like there's a big difference between communicating with God as like a regular, just a pintele yid, just a simple person, versus like you're a big P prophet chosen by God to deliver a message to the Jewish people. And like those prophets are hand selected by God. It's not like, yes, there's schools of prophecy, but also like I do feel like there's like an element of like divine um choice in the matter that's beyond like any one particular person deciding to be a prophet. You're just kind of gifted with that.
Right, right. That makes me wonder if, I guess I'm wondering if the psychedelic experience then is not necessarily recommended. Like,
When
would you say that there's that, like, what do we do with all this? What do we do? If I'm just a simple Jew, like not a prophet, not a Kabbalist, like should I seek psychedelic experiences? Will they help me understand God and my religion, even my Torah, in a deeper way? I mean, would you go so far as to, I mean, this is sort of a delicate question. I'm not asking you necessarily to recommend people take psychedelics, but is this, for the average seeker, the average Jew, the average seeker, like, is this an experience that we should have, that we should want?
I think every creature on the planet has like a divine right to to be in relationship with God, and and to also be in the healthiest form that they can possibly be in. So if you have no contraindications, or if you have the kalim in place, right? Like you know, like you're grounded in your life and you know who you are, and like your life's not going to fall apart if you like come to certain realizations under psychedelic, then like it's there's no guarantee that you're going to have a psychedelic experience and talk to God at all, and probably you won't. So like if you can just like have 6 hours of like feeling a little bit more connected to your inner self, like halavai, like you should like that it you should be so lucky. So like I don't think that's really the biggest concern. And like if your intention is like I'm taking a psychedelic and I want to be a prophet or have a prophetic experience, like that's a little bit of an ego trip. it's like, who are you to like say that? You can say like, I want to have a spiritual experience, like I want to see if I can connect, whatever. But it's like, I think that's again, and that has to do with like really honing your kalim. And when I say honing your kalim, I mean also like refining your midot, like refining your character traits that are based on potentially like partially the Kabbalistic approach to like, the divine makeup that is within each of us. Because I think it would be like a little bit like Shabtai Tzvi, like false prophet vibes, to to have such grand intentions. And again, intentions are a big part of psychedelic experience. I think everyone should have intention.
Right. Prophecy isn't something in our tradition, isn't something that people seek, right? It's something that is sort of it's bestowed upon them, and that in itself is a kind of a lesson. Like, like it's this is this is something that you may find yourself in, but is not necessarily something that you go out and
Humble yourself. Like Moshe Rabbeinu was considered to be the most humble person on earth, and he was like rejected his like he didn't even want it, and I think there's like a lot of that of like really having like that, and that's like a type of grounding in a way. He was so grounded on that level that he could actually be like such a prophet because that was his like proportion of like groundedness of kalim to hold all of that light.
All right, let me ask you one last question, which is let's take drugs out of the picture, as you did from the start, and said that the psychedelic experience is not necessarily a drug experience, but an experience of some kind of expansion of consciousness. I guess with these texts in mind, with our Torah in mind, I'm wondering what you think about someone who is seeking a psychedelic experience through the tools of religion and Torah and Judaism. What's that look like? Like, forget about ingesting something. What does the psychedelic path look like in Torah study, in just Jewish life?
Yeah, well, that's actually my next book that I just turned the first draft of in. It's like a Jewish psychedelic practical guide. And it's like using Judaism as their framework or the set and setting, so to speak, for a psychedelic experience to help you like prepare for, navigate, and integrate. So, first of all, it's like I would say like looking at the Jewish calendar and like what are the spiritual frequencies that are at play throughout different times of the year as both part of the set and the setting. So the set being like your internal world, like what you're personally bringing to the experience versus like what you're setting, like your outer circumstances bring to it. And like we have all these opportunities, like with Shabbat, with the Chagim, with even just like the themes of the month at hand that can really like help us connect and help us make sense of like what's going on internally and externally, and also like how to bring those themes into like our intentions with any any experience of expanded consciousness. Um, and then beyond that, there's like all sorts of like music that we can bring in, and I think like Hasidus, right? Like making it apply in regular life, um, like so much of like when I study Torah or Hasidus or whatever, it's like as I'm a journalist, I'm coming to this from like the lived experience of people, right? It's not academic for me, it's practical. So like how do you make it real right here, right now? And that's me taking Ram Dass and saying like, okay, here and now, where is it at? So
Ram Dass
I'll
is
get
still trolling you. You're still thinking about the here and now, right? Being here now.
always
Yeah.
right, because I'm also often like struggle to do that. So it's like really like my Tikkun in life, my thing I have to fix. Your
Your
question is
question is
like
like,
how do
how do
you
you
just
just
like
like
do
do
have
have
psychedelic
psychedelic
experience in
experience
a
in a
Jewish
Jewish
way?
way?
Yeah, like what is it? What is the Jewish psychedelic experience, taking drugs out of the question? Like, we have these texts that are so I think we would characterize them as psychedelic. So where does that leave us? Like where yeah. And I think one of the things that you're saying, or one of the references that you're giving us, is to Hasidut, like Hasidic, the Hasidic mystical tradition, which I think you're right is distinct in that it is attempting to take these sort of like, the quantum physics of our theology, the Kabbalah, which is so going all the way back to these texts we've been looking at in Tanakh, but things just get more and more and more complicated, more and more dizzying. And the Hasidic approach is an attempt to take those things and put them into simpler language, put them into plainer language to give everyone some access to this expanded conscious, mochin de gadlut, as you say, this expanded consciousness. So that's a good path, I think, that you're referencing for someone who is interested in these things, but but can't imagine going from zero to infinity.
I mean, I think there's like, I think Shabbos is the ultimate Jewish psychedelic. And I say that as like, I mean, Heschel writes about like Shabbos as like spirit in the form of time, where like you have this container, quote unquote, right? Like the keli that is, whether you're keeping Shabbos halachically or not, like you create the setting, right? Within which to like have this like set, like this Shabbos mode within yourself. In the same way, when you do a psychedelic, like you prepare the music in advance and you turn off your phone and there's all these like things like halachas that you do and don't do to just like ensure that you're gonna have a good trip. And Shabbos also is like such a trip, right? And like when you're able to like really feel into that, and like the concept of Shabbos being like this palace in time, right? Like this container of eternity almost, like where you don't really have a sense of time, like that is a psychedelic experience. Now, granted, like not your average Shabbos, like not everyone is tripping on Shabbos in that way. And it took me like really tripping, like taking substance on Shabbos in order to tune into that. But now that I have, like I actually can feel it like just 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 endogenously. So I would say that's one thing to start with is like how are you really informing your Shabbos practice? And then Shabbos is really like the baseline for engaging with the other chagim. So they're just like Shabbos with different flavors in a lot of ways. Um,
Different color frequencies, you might say. Yeah, I love that. I love that, Madison, and
yeah.
I
So
relate to
that's
it. Like I relate to it just like I often say that you unless you've tried Shabbat out, you really don't you, you can't understand what it's like to enter into a different sense of reality once a week. I mean, that's really the way I experience it. Is like my relationship to reality shifts once a week, and not because I'm ingesting anything, but because these like practices have kind of inducted me into a new state of consciousness. So I think it's a perfect example, and it's right there at the center of our tradition. So Madison, I'm so grateful to have been studying with you. I'm so grateful to know you. It's like an incredible thing. I met you as a student of mine, and now I feel like you're a teacher of mine. And you've got you're teaching lots of people now. You've got one book that you've mentioned, Exile and Ecstasy, and you just suggested that another one is coming soon. So more psychedelic Torah coming to come from Madison, and you're just the perfect person to study these texts that I have sort of puzzled over and for years and will continue to puzzle over, but your insights have really expanded my consciousness. So thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's really fun. So yeah, I can be a total nerd about all these things.
Yeah, well, this is a podcast for total nerds, so you're in the right place.